Good morning, Christopher. Good morning to Professor Harold Goodwin, fellow panelists, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for having me by video, and my sincere apologies that I can't be there at the World Travel Market in person. I would love to, but thanks to modern communication technology, I can at least deliver a few remarks. So thank you for the opportunity. I want to make 3 points, and then I want to conclude by, well, where to from here. Now, the first point is that the climate is changing much more rapidly than it was predicted. You all hear the news about hottest year on record, which was 2016, 1.1 degree warmer than the long-term average. And 2016, of course, just beat 2015, which was the hottest year. And 2017 is now on track on being the hottest or the second hottest year. Major changes in the Arctic sea ice, sea level rise is accelerating. A major storm, the intensity of storms, that's cyclones, but also, for example, thunderstorms and hailstorms, etc. The list is long, and we can witness it. We're not talking about climate change in 100 years. We're talking about literally living in a changing world with more and more extreme events. And of course, those impact on tourism. They affect the safety and lives. They affect tourism assets and infrastructure, in particular in the coastal areas. They affect the resource availability. Think about drought and water scarcity, and they affect the business risk, investment, insurance, etc. So we are in a changing world, and I think tourism needs to adapt much more proactively than we initially thought. The second point is around the carbon footprint of tourism, which continues to grow. Now, globally, carbon emissions are stabilizing somewhat. Of course, we're still emitting every year at a very high level, and concentrations in the atmosphere are increasing as a result every year. And we're now pretty much over 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every year, and that is obviously a very high level. At the current rate, we've got about 17 years until we reach those concentrations that will lead to a 2-degree warming or more. So we do need to decrease. But the problem is, and I think in tourism we can see that very well, that while there is awareness and more initiatives, it's what I call the fallacy of incremental change. So what I mean by that is that we see more and more initiatives, corporate social responsibility, low carbon, people share them, and that's all great. But we're not talking about the things we're not doing, and we're not talking about the growth of tourism. We're growing 5%, or here in my part of the world, over 10% growth in tourism. That, of course, increases the footprint dramatically more than those incremental changes. And I would like to use an analogy from health and diet. So if I have a terrible diet, and I decide, okay, that's bad, I start to cut out soft drinks, and I tell people I now don't have soft drinks anymore, and I'm doing really well, but I still have all the other stuff, and in fact I have more of it, so potentially things are getting worse, but I'm only focusing on the one good thing that I'm doing. That is a fallacy. And it might be quite deceptive, and it is a risk if I use that as a legitimate reason then to continue, or a license, a social license to grow by saying, oh, I'm doing these good things. So what I'm saying is we're seeing a lot of good things, a lot of good initiatives, but it can only be the start. It's probably not enough, and there's very few companies, and in fact, Christopher, you're one of them, who keep saying, it's not enough. I've reduced my emissions by 30%. What else can I do? I need to go down to zero in some ways, net zero, in line with the Paris Agreement. So that's the problem of the incremental change and the focus on efficiency rather than absolute reductions. And so that leads me to my third point, which is around the international pressure and the agreements, the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals that really demanded more and more from businesses and countries to report emissions, to measure them, to monitor them, to certify them, third-party verified, and to basically be transparent and ambitious. And I think tourism needs to be more involved in that. There's a lot of good action happening, but it is still quite insular and not comprehensive. So, for example, I looked at 200 reports filed for the Global Reporting Initiative. From those, who are already leading examples in the industry, only a third even choose to report carbon emissions. So reporting is key, otherwise we will not manage to control and drive down carbon emissions to meet this tight carbon budget. Now, where does this leave us? So just to summarize the 3 points, the first one is climate is changing more rapidly than we thought. We're already in a world of changes. The second one is the carbon footprint. And the third one is the policies, the agreements, the expectations on carbon reporting. All of those to meet rapid, accelerated action, transformation. All these, in some ways, buzzwords, but it is true. We're running out of time. We don't have much time left to make some substantial changes. There's a little bit of reason for optimism. I did mention about stabilizing CO2 emissions. We have rapid investment and extension in renewable energy sources, also electrification of transport, although sometimes it's tricky when you change one part of the system, so you have more electric vehicles, but you haven't adjusted the other part fast enough, which is developing actually the zero carbon electricity or the infrastructure that goes with it. So there's a little bit room for improvement, and tourism can definitely be more part of that. Key things for tourism are planners and destination managers consider the impacts more proactively. For example, coastal investment, which there's lots going on. Consider sea level rise, consider the impacts of storms, prepare for water scarcity, have these systems in place. That then leads to the question, in some places, is tourism actually a good choice? Remote island destinations who really like to invest in tourism, want to attract cruise ships, everything, major international airports. Sure, it's a tool for development, but tourism comes at a cost. It competes with the local population for resources, water, for example. It leaves a trail of pollution, waste management. It comes at a carbon cost to bring tourists there, supply chains, etc. In some places, supply chains can be made much more local, which would reduce the carbon footprint. But in other places, it is very carbon and resource intensive to operate tourism, and in some ways then quite vulnerable as well. So I think we need to think a little bit more carefully, where do we want, how much and what type of tourism, where is it sustainable, where can we deliver it in the long term. We also need much more radical change. We can't rely on incremental change. As I said, that's a fallacy. We need completely revolutionary building design, water management, renewable energy, right built in, supply chain management, staff training, guest behavior. And that's a key thing. Involve the guests, bring the guests back in, don't be shy of involving them. Tourism can be an opportunity to reconnect them to nature, to educate them about particular behaviors, whether it's around water, energy, other things to do with nature, tree planting, etc. Tourists need to be part of the solution. So I'm looking forward to hearing what else comes out of the session, but I hope you're having a very robust discussion on some of the constraints we're actually facing for tourism. We have to talk about the growth paradigm. We have to talk about radical changes. We have to be a little bit more honest about what tourism can achieve and what it may not be able to achieve, or where we have to do things very differently. I don't have the answers to that. I actually think the next step would be to have a think tank or some substantial initiative to really think outside the box. What are these transformational changes? What would it mean for tourism? What are the technologies? What are the compromises? What are the knowledge gaps? What do we need to do for tourism to reach net zero emissions by 2050 if we did our fair share for the Paris Agreement? So I think a lot of thought needs to go into that. Otherwise, we simply will not make it. So thank you again for the opportunity, and have a very productive time at the World Travel Market. Bye.